Good evening and welcome to the Defacto Review, your weekly roundup of the biggest stories shaping Mongolia. I'm Rachel Donovan and joining me tonight is our commentator, Mogi Badrobontoy. Welcome.
Thank you.
We're live on Facebook at V Television, and as always, we want to hear your thoughts on tonight's topics, so you can leave us any comments on Facebook or Twitter using hashtag JargleDefacto. Coming up on the program tonight, Mongolian metals and Step Gold hint at launching IPOs on the Toronto Stock Exchange. 30 outbreaks of foot and mouth disease and other causes have led to significant reductions in livestock numbers in 2018. Trade with Russia has risen 52% and with China just 0.3%. And women, men and children show their support for gender equality. The Prospectors and Developers Association of Canada completed their 2018 convention this week, and GoGo Mongolia has reported that Mongolian companies Mongolian Metals Corporation and Step Gold are entertaining the possibility of joining the Toronto Stock Exchange. The news site reports that Mongolian Metals plans to use their IPOs to fund new explorations following their discovery of significant gold, copper and silver deposits last year. Meanwhile, Step Gold plans to commence new operations in Bayankongor Amag. GoGo also reports that Xanadu Mines, which is currently listed on the Australian Stock Exchange, is seeking dual listing on TSX, and that Erdene Resource Development, currently listed on the Toronto Stock Exchange, is seeking dual listing in Mongolia. So, Mogi, looking first at those that are seeking to launch IPOs, what's the appeal and the risk of Mongolian companies for the Toronto Stock Exchange?
Well, the TSX is nothing new to Mongolia. One of the first foreign mining and exploration companies to invest in Mongolia came out of the TSX. Well, there's a global appeal for TSX. Well, Canada being a mining company, there's a lot of capital in Canada that understands the risk of exploration, and they're very keen to invest in risky exploration stage companies. So it's a natural destination for any, I would say, globally operating exploration companies to seek to raise funding from Canada. One of the other exchanges that's very appealing for research companies is obviously the ASX, the Australian Securities Exchange. So there's new companies seeking IPOs in Canada, I think, is a testament to well, the global commodity prices being very favorable, and also Mongolia becoming economically more stable, politically more stable, and I think this shows that investors are, appetite for Mongolia again is returning from at least Canada in this situation.
And Xanadu Mines looking for dual listing in TSX and the Australian Securities Exchange. Could we expect other companies to follow their example and seek dual listing?
I would say so. Currently, the only company that's dual listed is probably Turquoise Hill Resources, which is listed in New York and Toronto as well. So Xanadu will be the next one. They're seeking listing from Canada because, according to their CEO, their investor portfolio has become increasingly diverse. I would say, I guess it was initially investors from Australia. Now there's more investors from Canada joining in the scene, so they want to be more closer to their investors, and it was probably a natural step for Xanadu Mines to seek listing and raise funds from Toronto.
And Erdene Resource Development going for the Toronto and Mongolia dual listing.
Well, for Erden's case, I would say it's a little different from Xanadu. They're not particularly seeking to raise a lot of money from the local stock exchange. I would say, yes, that's one reason, but I would say the bigger reason is for the corporate social responsibility aspect of it. Erden has been operating in Mongolia for almost 2 decades now, so they know Mongolia. They're very close to Mongolian investors and the local people, so they want to allow Mongolian investors to be able to partake in some of their successes they've been having in the last couple of years. The exploration stage results have been very good, which is reflected in their share prices in the last couple of years. So, CSR is probably more the reason why Erden wants to list in this local stock exchange. And Erden would be the first company to list in Mongolia and overseas, dual listing locally and overseas. So you could potentially open up the way for more companies to seek dual listing on the local stock exchange as well. Recently, the Mongolian Stock Exchange and the regulators, they finally passed the dual listing regulations, allowing for Erden to seek a listing. So Erden would be the first test case. So I'm sure it will be successful. I'm sure Mongolian investors are very interested in their explorations, and their gold projects in Baihongar are doing very well. They could start mining right away if they wanted to, but they obviously want to see how big that gold deposit is. So they're continuing to drill. So it's already a proven project. So it would be natural. It wouldn't be too risky for anyone. Well, obviously there's a risk, but it wouldn't be too surprising if Mongolian investors would be very interested in buying Erden Resource shares from the local stock exchange.
You make it sound like there's quite a few benefits and somewhat risk-free. But what are some of the risks for Mongolian metals and Steppe Gold moving on to the Toronto exchange?
Well, obviously, any exploration company is it's a risky business by nature. So obviously, these companies always say that it would be risky investment, and regulators always warn that any kind of exploration companies is very risky. They say that, well, experts say that 1 in 1,000 exploration projects become successful. So it's a risky business by nature. So obviously, these are all exploration stage companies. So it would be prudent to have a little cautious mind behind when you interested in buying shares. And if you wanted to explain some of the companies that just trying to list on the TSX, Mongolian Metals Corporation is owned by a local company called Asia Pacific Investment Partners. It's Mongolian investors might know one of their maybe even more famous subsidiaries. It's called Mongolian Properties. It's a property company and run by an American Mongolian businessman. So people might be already familiar with some of the owners behind Mongolian Metals Corporation. And Steppe Gold is also it's not new to Mongolia. The company behind it is called Garrison Capital. It's an Australian company that seeks new exploration companies, and they're not new to Mongolia because they've had several successful listings on the Australian Securities Exchange from Mongolian exploration companies. The most famous one would be Hunu Coal. It was a coal company listed in 2010 at 20 Australian cents, and a year and a half later they were sold for $1.80 to a big Thai coal company called Bampu. So they're not new to Mongolia, and they're very experienced in the exploration scene. So and Xanadu Mines has also been in Mongolia for more than a decade. So they're not new to Mongolia. They've been very successful with their exploration lately. So I'm sure there would be enough interest from Canadian investors.
When would you expect them to enter the Toronto Stock Exchange? So GoGo has reported that this is coming off of the convention. I'm sure there was a big atmosphere there.
Right. Well, Xanadu Mines, and they've been seeking to list, and they've been preparing to list on TSX for at least a year now. So, obviously these kind of IPOs need the right timing. If the commodity prices are good, if Mongolia is still stable, they need to find the right timing to list it on to get a good valuation. So, I'm sure they're keen to list very soon, but it all depends on the right timing. So I think within a couple of months that we would see something progress in their listing ambitions.
Thank you. Moving on to agriculture, and just 10 weeks into 2018, the Ministry for Food, Agriculture and Light Industry has reported that 700,000 animals have died since January in Mongolia. Of particular concern is the incidence of foot and mouth disease. The National Emergency Management Agency reported 30 confirmed outbreaks across 27 SUMs, affecting 4,468 animals. Responding to outbreaks of foot and mouth disease in 2016 cost the government approximately 28 billion tugruks. In other agricultural news, the USDA has sent some representatives to visit Mongolia to explore potential cooperation, and the director of the Livestock Genetic Resource Centre, Di Zolmon, has told GoGo Mongolia that that support could include purchasing donor animals, genetic material, or new research equipment from the United States. These outbreaks can be devastating for herders in particular. What effect can they have on the economy?
Right, whenever these kind of livestock diseases happen, the government comes in and starts destroying those livestock. So they could potentially bankrupt the herder potentially. But there's a small compensation, obviously. But in fact, it's the herder will probably, the livestock business might die. But for the economy, every time there's a foot and mouth disease, every time there's a zud where large number of livestock die, it affects the economy directly, because this is when comes spring and summer, meat prices go up, and if meat is being a staple of the of consumption, a big part of the consumer price basket, so it affects inflation as well. So it can have a devastating effect on the economy. So, but 700,000 livestock sounds a lot. We were talking about this before, but this particular winter has been bad. But we had a decent summer, so good summer is always good. Prevents any kind of zud effect. So 700,000, relatively compared to the other zud we had, is not a particularly big number. Yeah.
And looking at the potential to work with the United States, getting either donor animals, genetic material, new research equipment, what impact do you think that would have on, in particular, the effects of disease and the scale of disease?
Well, every time there's a disease outbreak, Mongolian government is always late to handle it. And it's, whenever there's an outbreak, that's when the government decides to import large amounts of vaccines, where it should be the other way around, where vaccines are supposed to be preventive, right? So we should be vaccinating our livestock way before the winter comes. So hopefully these 7 million doses will be administered during the summer, where it actually needs to be administered. So, but the effect, Mongolia is trying to move away from being a mining-dependent country, and agriculture is supposed to be natural second sector we're supposed to be focused on. But these outbreaks of foot and mouth diseases, it happens every year, and every time it happens, countries who import meat from Mongolia, they always close the door, and then we have to start all over again, prove them that our livestock is healthy again, and then next winter comes, and then another case of foot and mouth disease happens, and then the whole entire country is banned. But where this doesn't happen in other countries, where more experienced countries, right? So if there's a disease in Western Australia, people don't start blocking the entire country from buying Australian beef, right? So it needs to be isolated, and it needs to be proven that it's isolated, which this is where the part where the government needs to do a lot more to certify those livestock and be able to isolate them and prove them that cases where there's no foot and mouth disease, that the beef and the meat is healthy, which doesn't happen because the whole country, the livestock is not certified at all. The whole country is seen as one meat producer, and then if there's one case of disease, the whole country is banned from exporting meat. So this needs to be addressed as soon as possible if you want to try to diversify the economy and become a meat exporting and agriculture economy.
Mentioning exporting is a fantastic segue into our next story. Montsme.mn this week reported the most recent trade data. The news site noted that total turnover was $785 million US dollars, which is a $5 million drop in exports, but an $84 million increase in imports compared to figures from the same period last year. Further comparing these figures, we see that Russian trade increased 52%, accounting for 16% of Mongolian foreign trade. Mongolia's major trading partner continues to be China, which accounts for 61% of total foreign trade turnover, an increase of just 0.3%. Looking at imports, construction materials machinery amounted to 34% of total imports, with consumer goods and oil products making up then the majority of other imports into Mongolia. So Mongolia's closest neighbours remain the country's most important trade partners. Is there anything surprising in these figures?
Well, the trade with Russia up 52% sounds like a significant development, but in actuality, our trade is mostly imports, and meaning oil products, meaning diesel and gasoline. So oil prices have been rising last year to the point where our gas distributors were not able to have enough stock of reserves to be able to supply the whole country, where distributing gas stations did not have enough gasoline. There was a big line during the winter. There was a big discussion about it in the last couple of months. This was related to oil prices being up, and then because of the IMF program, we increased our import tariffs on gasoline. And because of that, there was a big shortage of gasoline during the winter, and this is probably why trade with Russia went up. So export to Russia only went up 30.4%, which is only 5.2 million. And import went up 53.3%, which is just 123 million. So there's a big imbalance between import and export relations with Russia, where Mongolia imports and does not export to Russia. And diesel and gasoline imports went up 18.4. In total, they amount to around 54 million out of the 123 million we import from Russia. So this would be the biggest bulk of our imports. Russia is the biggest country we import from. They amount to around 34.1% of all of our imports, which is from Russia, and it's mostly gasoline. And then there's a lot of consumer goods, food items that we import from Russia as well. So the reason why trade went up was, oil price went up, and then we bought some more consumer products from Russia, which is a big exporter to Mongolia as well.
So I mentioned that construction materials and machinery were a significant amount of imports, followed by consumer goods and oil products. Mm-hmm. In what products can we expect to see a change in either imports or exports in the near future?
Well, I would say it would be rather stable. The 34% import increase in construction materials is an obvious sign of Mongolia preparing for the construction season. So economy is picking up again. So the first thing that stops during economic downturn is construction. So we obviously seeing return of more investment in construction. There's a lot of unfinished buildings if you look around UB. these projects are probably having better chances of getting investment in them. So obviously Mongolia imports most of the construction materials to be able to finish them. So and then during winter no construction happens, and then from March, April, this is when construction happens. So you need a lot of materials to start to begin a project like that. So it's that's why we probably saw an increase in the number of construction materials being imported more to Mongolia.
You mentioned that those instances of foot and mouth disease definitely would have affected exporting of agricultural material. As the National Emergency Management Agency gets a hold of those outbreaks and isolates those, do you think that those exports will increase soon, or it'll take a while?
It'll take a while. During the spring is also when the biggest number of casualties happen resulting from dzud, because in spring, when the snow melts and then it freezes during the night, it creates problems for livestock to graze. If it was just snow, they would be able to dig through the snow and eat graze. But in spring is when you would think that when temperatures are becoming warmer, dzud would not affect as much as during the winter, but it's actually the reverse. Spring is where the biggest number of casualties happen. So yeah, this will probably 700,000. I'm sure the number will increase as we go near the summer, closer to summer. So obviously this will affect the local consumption of meat as well. Meat prices might go up during the summer, and then which usually it does. That this is when Mongolia has the least amount of livestock. End of summer is when you have the largest amount of livestock, and then this will affect the meat prices and potentially our export of meat as well.
Moving on to our final story, and this past Thursday, Mongolia celebrated International Women's Day, and we saw men, women and children take to the streets in support of ending gender inequality. Activists from 1 Billion Rising, the Mothers Association and the Mongolian Youth Federation each organised demonstrations campaigning for the end of all forms of gender-based violence. Now, we've seen a lot of demonstrations this past week and also last November during the 16 days of activism to end gender-based violence. The challenge that these demonstrations always face is how to maintain the pressure for change after these public holidays or after these massive international events. How can these rights groups maintain that pressure on government, on the private sector, after the public holiday has finished?
Well, this is the usual problem with NGOs, right? NGOs being mostly pure volunteer-based organizations who don't get paid to be able to organize this kind of events. So it's always a problem with NGOs. So, but my understanding is that, and from my interaction with a lot of these NGOs, is that they found ways to continue moving it, being from getting grants from international organizations, organizing seminars. They need to continue. They can't just focus on major holidays or events and do a protest. They need to continue the momentum by organizing and training people on getting to understand the issue at heart, and obviously the gender-based violence is a problem and a talk of society as well. But I'm glad that a lot of these cases are now coming out to light. There have been more cases of public cases of violence against children, violence against women that's coming up to in the spotlight. But which doesn't mean that these types of violences are increasing. I would say they're coming out into light more, and that's I think it's a good sign. If there's more cases being discussed publicly, obviously nobody agrees with these types of violence, so that society is united in trying to forcing and pressuring the government to do something about it. So these NGOs need to be commended on organizing. It's not the first time they're organizing these kind of events. So it's commendable that they're not just using public holidays, especially on the Women's Day, to be able to demonstrate these things, and not just using the Children's Day to demonstrate against violence against children. So it's very commendable.
Do you think we'll see more demonstrations or more public activities from these NGOs as we do get into warmer weather?
Yeah, well, springtime is usually the time where a lot of protests happen. Not just protests against domestic violence or children. It's also it's a political protest season as well. So it's springtime. We'll probably see more and more protests. 2018 being sort of the middle year where there's no elections, maybe we'll not see as much political protests as different years. But yeah, obviously, there's I was being told that the mothers and parents against air pollution are going to do another protest as air pollution seems to subside during warmer weathers. It's important not to forget the problems when they disappear for a period of time and then come back the next year.
I was going to ask you about that because that's one of the topics that seems to disappear over the summer.
And then it disappears from our topics of conversation as well, but it's inevitable that the air pollution will come back. So it's important to use the warmer weathers to prepare for the next winter. Yeah. And what I also wanted to say was the new law against domestic violence is in force, and there seems to be misunderstanding of. There's a topic of conversation in social media in the last couple of days where which is the allowable age where you won't get jailed for having sex with an underage children, whether it's 14 or not. There was a big debate about it. So it means that the public doesn't understand the law as well. The new criminal code came into force from January last year, and in fact, lawyers have been telling that the penalties for unconsented sex with an underage has increased, but there's been deliberate sort of fake news in social media where it's telling us that if you have sex with an underage girl, if there's consent, there's only going to be a penalty without any jail sentence, which was creating a lot of noise in social media the last couple of days.
But that's incorrect.
That's incorrect, yeah.
Right.
So, social media it's not an issue that's only solely happening in Mongolia, where with the prevalence of social media, there's also prevalence of fake news as well, and it's amazing how quickly it spreads, especially when it's bad news.
Right. And with that new legislation coming into effect, have we seen the very real impact of that yet, or when can we expect to see the impact?
Yeah, there's been a couple of high-profile criminal cases where a man was jailed. I believe it was more than 10 years for assaulting a minor. There's been a case of where a little hotel, we can't even call it a hotel, a motel type of place where underage girl was raped by 3 guys, and the hotel allowed them to enter and take a room, and that's been punished under the new law as well. So yeah, there seems to be more cases being trialed and rightfully penalized for these kind of grievous assaults. Yeah.
Awesome, thank you, and thank you for joining us tonight. We will see you next week at 8 p.m. here on V Television and on the V Television Facebook page. Good night.